Sciences, Michael Fine. Dean Fine, will you please stand up to be recognized? It is also my pleasure to welcome all the members of the Johnson & Wales community joining us here today. Now, the university began offering the Cultural Life Series in the early 1990s to expand students' knowledge of the world and directly engage the Johnson & Wales community in important global social issues. The benefits are many for the students who attend these programs. They develop broad worldviews, they have an opportunity to appreciate creative expression in many forms, and they are encouraged to become lifelong learners. Our cultural life educational events have brought world-renowned novelists, scientists, journalists, activists, and scholars to the university, both to present topics related to the human experience and to engage with students and faculty across our many multiple disciplines. From nationally recognized pollster John Zogby to activist Temple Grandin to tissue engineer and CEO of Epibone, Nina Tandon, we certainly have had a wide range of speakers who have visited Johnson & Wales over the years. We offer a special thank you to the chair of the JWU Board of Trustees, Ms. Jim Hance, and longtime board member John Hazen White. Their support of the Cultural Life Series has allowed us to bring to Johnson & Wales last year's speaker, neuroscientist and author Dr. Rachel Hertz, and this year's speaker, Dr. Paul Piff. Going forward, thanks to Rob Palesci, a JWU graduate and member of our Board of Trustees, and the Palesci Family Endowed Fund, the Cultural Life Series will continue to be hosted by the Inter-College Cultural Life Committee. At this time, I would like to ask Daisha Johnson, 22, to come forward to introduce this year's Johnson & Wales Cultural Life Series speaker. Daisha is a senior in the graduating class of 2022, majoring in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. For experience in her chosen fields of study, Daisha completed an internship with the Inspiring Minds, a Rhode Island nonprofit that empowers children to engage with and enjoy their schooling as a means of escaping poverty. She taught fourth grade students at Inspiring Minds in Providence. Her goal is to work with youth in crisis and juvenile detention. Our Cultural Life speaker today identifies cooperation, understanding, and working across social divides as essential to the overall success of our society. Daisha is a model of these attributes, and we are proud to have her introduce our speaker today. We had a lovely lunch together, and I learned she was also on the Denver campus, which was my home for so long, and so I ask you to come to the stage now, Daisha, to introduce Dr. Piff.
Thank you, Provost Wiscott. I am honored today to introduce as this year's Cultural Life Series speaker, Dr. Paul Piff. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Science at University of California, Irvine. At the university, he also directs the Morality, Emotion, and Social Hierarchy Lab. Dr. Piff's research examines the psychological impacts of inequality, the origin of human kindness, and the social effects of nature. In 2015, he was named a Rising Star by the Association of Psychological Science. His work has been featured in the New York Times, New York Magazine, and the award-winning film Capital in the 21st Century. Today, his presentation is on privilege, compassion, and social cohesion. At the conclusion of this presentation, he will take questions from the audience. Dr. Piff, we welcome you to Johnson & Wales University as this year's Cultural Life Series speaker.
That was amazing. My microphone like dangling in between my legs when I get up. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Let's see here. Perfect. Thank you so much for that very, very generous welcome, Daisha. Ken, Thanks so much. Well, wait, one more round of applause for Daisha. Yeah. Ken reached out 3 years ago, inviting me to be a part of this, and I'd been looking forward to the opportunity for lots of reasons. It couldn't happen until now, but it's so great to visit Jay Wu, to get a sense of what's driving this really thriving community. Rich, it's been great to connect with you. Amy, you're somewhere here. It's been such a treat. Thank you so much for everything you've done. Lisa, thanks for being the support and backbone to everything that's happening today. And thanks to each of you for being here. I remember when I was a college student, sitting in one of these seats, coming to one of these kinds of talks, and occasionally finding something that a speaker said really transformative. And so put yourself in my shoes, where less than 20 years later, I'm up here in a similar role to those speakers that I was looking up at from your seats. And so it's a thrill for me to be here. So thanks so much. As Daisha said, and as Rich said, what I want to talk to you about is some of the work that I've been doing in collaboration with folks at some different universities, looking at the role of privilege, of money, of status in shaping how we think about ourselves, how we relate to one another, and in sort of fraying social connection. And so I'm going to treat you like social scientists. I'm going to talk to you about studies. And then I'm going to end with some conclusions that I think point toward some possible ways forward. Okay. So, about 20 years ago, I was supposed to board a plane flying from the East Coast to the West Coast. And when I tried to check in, I was told that my seat had been double booked. And if you don't mind, we've got to move you to a later flight. I'm super bummed. It means I'm going to have to wait in the airport for a few extra hours. But they were offering me a perk, and I could get upgraded to first class. So I'd never flown first class before. This is a great opportunity to fly first class. I'd seen first class before. I'd heard stories about it, so I jumped at the opportunity. All right, so there I am in this first class seat. It's a lot bigger. I've already been given some ice cream. I'm trying to figure out how my seat goes up and down, so it's like moving up and down as people are boarding the plane, walking past the first class section, moving on to economy class. This is an experience all of us, unless you've flown first class your whole life, there's a whole other section at the back of the plane called economy. That's less comfortable. So anyway, I'm sitting in the seat, people are boarding, they're walking past me, and I remember being a little bit embarrassed, like you're kind of like sitting in this luxurious position as other people are walking past you, like shuffling past, working their way to the other section. But I remember even early on in that experience, feeling kind of special. Here I am, like sipping on a beverage, eating a little bit of ice cream, sitting in a slightly bigger seat, more comfortable, reclined, as other people uncomfortably are making their way to the back. I'm a little special, a little deserving of this, a little better, if you will. Despite not having done anything to be in that first class seat in the first place. I had just randomly been in a seat that got double booked. So, a few years later, as a grad student, I wanted to test out this basic idea by having people play a game of Monopoly. And this wasn't your usual game of Monopoly. This is a game of Monopoly that I rigged so that with a flip of a coin, one of the two players in this game would get randomly assigned to be a rich player. So they'd get 3 times as much money to play the game with. When they passed go, they'd collect twice the salary. They got to roll both dice instead of one, so they'd move around the board a lot faster. And they got to move the Rolls Royce around the board. You know about that Rolls Royce. That's a pretty nice piece. Compared to the poor player who got half the money, only got to roll one die instead of both dice, collected half the salary, and they moved the measly shoe around. And we had them play for 15 minutes. Flip of a coin. And we just wanted to watch what happens over the course of these 15 minutes through hidden cameras. So, some of the audio might be a little muddled. We've got subtitles here.
How many 500s do you have?
Just one.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I have 3. I don't know why they made me so much.
So they quickly figure out something's amiss. Here's one person saying, I've got 3 500s and you've only got one, okay? But over the course of 15 minutes, what we noticed was really dramatic differences start to emerge between the two players. The rich player, almost like in the wild, you see primates that are more dominant start to take up more physical space. They become more dominant in their behavior. In this game, players became more dominant. They made more noise as they moved around the board, slapping the board with their piece. They took up more physical space. They were more like to showcase their success in the game.
Yes.
We had a bowl of pretzels positioned off to the side there. And we just track how many pretzels players help themselves to.
Are those pretzels or
I don't know.
And even though players quickly are like, why is that bowl of pretzels there? Are they there for experimental reasons? The power of the situation seems to inevitably take over, and they start helping themselves to more pretzels.
Pretzels.
As the game went on, one of the things that we noticed that I think was surprising to me is that players who were rich became more showcasing of their success. They would fan their money out, they would talk about how well they were doing, and they became, as the game went on, increasingly less sympathetic to the plight of these poor players. Far more behaving in ways that demonstrated their own success in the game, way less empathetic, way less sympathetic.
I have some money. I have money for everything. You own $24. There's all your money set. I don't buy it. I mean, I have so much money. I have so much money, it takes away from everything.
I'm gonna buy out this whole board.
You're gonna run out of money soon. You're pretty much untouchable at this point.
At the end of the game, we asked the players to tell us about their experiences. Now, the rich players invariably win. They always win. The game's rigged to let them win. And we asked them at the end of the game to tell us why they think they won. And they fill out a bunch of questionnaires. I think what struck me as a young grad student at the time was that all of the rich players became significantly more likely to attribute their inevitable success in the game to things they did, to decisions they made, to their business acumen, their skills at Monopoly. And not a single person talked about that flip of a coin that randomly got them into that position of privilege in the first place. And that's the substance of what I want to talk to you about today. The blinders that privilege gives us. So, I have spent the last 15 years studying class privilege, money, wealth, status. There are many other forms of privilege we can think about that I think are equally important. I'm not going to talk about them today, but I think they're just as worth thinking about and considering, whether it's privilege you experience as a result of your age, your height, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your physical attractiveness, many forms of privilege. I would say that what I'm going to talk about today are just as applicable to class as they are to other domains. And what I've just been interested in over this many years is in how a person's relative advantage compared to others, having more than others, being better off than others, shapes, changes how you think about yourself and behave toward one another. And I'm going to try to make the case to you today that it does. So, I'm going to talk about privilege and how that intersects with the sense of deservingness, how it shapes and gets in the way of compassion and social cohesion, our tendencies to be empathetic and mindful of others and willing to collaborate with other people. And then I'm going to talk about things that we might do, psychological processes that we can leverage to actually cultivate more compassion and more social cohesion. So, starting with deservingness. How does privilege relate to deservingness? About 11 or 12 years ago, just shortly after the economic recession in 2007, 2008, This American Life sent some reporters down to Wall Street, and the reporters are hanging out in this bar that's a famous hangout for people who work on Wall Street. And don't be distracted by this wall of text, but I pulled it from the episode where these reporters are talking to these Wall Street executives about why they survived the financial crash. Now, Wall Street, the financial sector, was bailed out by the government during the recession. And this reporter is saying, and even if the government bails out your industry that failed, you still say it's because you're smarter? Bar patron one, there at the bottom, no. The government bailing out an industry was out of necessity for whatever the situation was. The fact that I benefited from that is because I'm smart. I took advantage of a situation. The only reason I've been doing this for so long is because I must be smarter than the next guy. 95% of the population doesn't have that common sense. So here you go. You've got someone who directly benefited from external assistance and still attributing their success to their individual acumen. So we've tested this out in lots of different ways. Here's one simple study. Here we ask people who differ in their levels of wealth to select a set of circles that best represents how they see themselves in relation to others. So if you look on the left, there's a circle that says me, there's 3 other circles that say O. People are asked to imagine those set of circles that say O. Those are circles that represent others. The circle that says me, think of that as the circle that represents you. Select the set of circles that best represents how you see yourself in relation to other people. And people can select a set of circles that identifies them as being the same size, all the way up to a circle that identifies them as being 4 times the size of others. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to select a circle that represents yourself as far larger than other people. We ask college students. Here, this is about 3,600 college students across the country. Now, college students have not directly contributed to their socioeconomic standing, for the most part, yet. What they have is largely the result of what their parents have. And we measure their sense of entitlement using the psychological entitlement scale, like where they indicate their agreement with statements saying, I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than others, or my favorite one, if I were on the Titanic, I would deserve to be on the first lifeboat. I know, I see some people like snickering. Yeah, like who would agree with that? Yeah, some people agree with that item. The wealthier your parents are, not the wealthier you are, the wealthier your parents are, the more likely you are to agree with statements like that, the more entitled and deserving of good things in life you feel relative to others. We ran another study looking at another form of preoccupation with the self, here literally looking at whether people would spend time looking at themselves in a mirror. So in this study, we have people exit one lab, and they're walking down the hallway, and they're told to go to a second lab just down the hallway. But as they walk the hallway, there's a mirror. And we just secretly have a researcher there observing and recording whether our participant stops in the mirror and starts checking themselves out. We time them. Are they checking themselves out? We time them for how long? Wealthier participants, far more likely to spend time checking themselves out in the mirror and looking at their reflections than less well-off people. Suggesting maybe that when it comes to the sense that I'm a little better, I'm a little more special, I'm a little more entitled, I'm a little more deserving, wealth plays a role. What about compassion, which is an emotion that's guided by an orientation to the well-being of others? To experience compassion, you first need to be attuned to others. You need to be able to look around you, see if someone is suffering or experiencing need, and then feel motivated to do something on their behalf. So we've done this in a lot of different ways. In one study, we just measure the kinds of emotions people experience in everyday life as a function of their wealth. What we find is that wealthier participants experience emotions that are all about the self, like pride. They're far less likely to experience emotions that are about other people, like love or compassion. Significantly less likely to experience on a daily basis emotions that connect them to others. In another study, we measured people's heart rates as they watched a video of children who had been diagnosed with cancer. Now, one of the things that we know about the heart when people are experiencing compassion, it's kind of an interesting quirk of our physiology. When you're feeling compassion or empathy or sympathy for someone, your heart rate actually slows down. It decelerates. We don't necessarily know why that is. One possibility is that in order to take care of other people, you need to first kind of relax yourself, soothe yourself so that you can take action on someone else's behalf. What we found is that everyone's heart rate goes down. Yes, but if you're lower in social class, if you're less well off in the blue line, your heart rate decelerates far more than if you're well off, who show some compassion, but not nearly as much. A few years later, Ph.D. and Eric Knowles, she's also my wife, but she and I weren't married at this time. She ran a study using eye tracking, where she looks at whether people, when looking at street scenes on Google Street View, what do they attend to? What do their eyeballs attend to? What are they focused on? What do they emphasize in their visual fields? If you're well off, you're significantly less likely, looking at Google Street View, to look at other people. You don't care about other people. You're far less attuned to other people in the social environment. She uses Google Glass and looked at what people look at when they're walking around the streets of New York. Same kind of thing. So even on a very basic, rudimentary level, what people emphasize motivationally by just a function of what they look at, wealth and privilege play a role. Now, you can ask, what does all that have to do with kindness? Which I would define as the extent to which you're willing to do something, sometimes costly, for yourself, that helps out another person or another group of people. How does privilege, how does wealth, how does status influence that? Easy to come up with one answer, right? If you've got a lot of money, if you've got a lot of resources, sharing a little bit of those resources with someone else should be less meaningful, right? Like, what's $5 to a billionaire? $5 to someone who has far lesser means, far less significant, right? Now, we're not studying billionaires, but we do run studies where we look at kindness. Here, this is a laboratory study where we use a task called the dictator task. It's called the dictator because we ask you, as a participant in our study, to act as if you're dictating how much money another person gets. Here's how it works. We give you $10. Those $10 are yours to keep. However, there's a person in this study that you've been paired with who didn't get any dollars. You're never going to meet them. They're never going to meet you. It's totally anonymous. How many of your $10 do you want to give away, if any? You don't have to tell me, just put them in this envelope. And we just measure, as a function of wealth, how much money people give away. The wealthier you were, the less generous you were in this study. People who made upwards of $200,000 a year actually gave a third as much as people in our study who made $25,000 or less a year. A third as much. Now, that trend that we found in the lab finds some reflection in nationwide studies of charitable giving or of philanthropy. Here's a Chronicle of Philanthropy study from 2014 showing that this is proportional giving, but households that make less, $50,000 to $75,000, give on average almost 2 times as much proportionally as households of greater means. Now you could ask, yeah, but that's how you get wealthy. You don't get wealthy by giving all your money away. You get wealthy by being mindful of money, right? Not necessarily being generous, but of being practiced at how to navigate the world and accumulate resources and save. Okay, so we've run studies not looking at how much wealth you have and correlating it with your kindness, but where we experimentally manipulate how rich you feel, irrespective of how much money you actually have, to see if that actually causes people to be less generous, less ethical, less mindful of others' needs. So here's one way we do it. Besides the monopoly experiment that I just began the talk with today, that's another example of how we might do it, but here's a simpler one, where we just ask people to imagine themselves in relation to someone either at the top or at the bottom of society. So someone who's the richest, who has the most amount of money, education, or occupational prestige, or to imagine themselves in relation to someone at the very bottom who has the least amount of money, education, and occupational prestige. And the idea is pretty simple. If you compare yourself, it doesn't matter who you are, if you compare yourself to someone at the very top, you could be made to feel a little bit less, relatively speaking, well off. And if you compare yourself to someone all the way at the bottom, you can be made to feel, relatively speaking, a little bit better off. So in one experiment, we just have people complete this manipulation, where we randomly assign them to either feel a little better off than someone else or a little worse off than someone else. And then they complete a questionnaire here of ethical decision making, where they indicate how likely they would be to engage in a variety of different unethical acts. Here's one, where people are asked to imagine that they've waited in line at a coffee shop for a coffee and a muffin. They pay for that coffee and a muffin with $10, but they mistakenly receive change as if they'd been paid with, paid 20, so they receive some extra change. How likely would they be to keep the extra change as opposed to giving it back? 7 other unethical acts that they're also asked to indicate how likely they would be to engage in, like cheating on tests, etc. Then they're prompted by the computer to exit the lab and enter the hall, where they're greeted by an experimenter who's holding a jar of candy. And the jar of candy has a sign that's been written on it that says it's reserved for kids who are participating in developmental studies in a nearby lab. And the experimenter asks our participant to watch over this jar of candy as they return to the lab to set up the second part. And we just monitor how much candy participants help themselves to. You know where this is going. Participants who we made feel rich. Again, not actually rich participants, participants who just via this manipulation have compared themselves to someone less well off than they are, so they're feeling, relatively speaking, a little better off, make more unethical decisions. They're more likely to say they would engage in things that we would consider immoral. They take 2 times as much candy from this jar of candy reserved for kids. Now, that's experimental evidence suggesting that there might be something to feeling better off than other people that makes you feel better than other people. That the mind translates relative advantage to deservingness. We don't distinguish between feeling better off than someone and feeling more special or better than someone, and that's a dangerous proposition. We've run other studies in the real world looking at whether these patterns that we find as a function of privilege might manifest in even everyday settings in the lab. So we ran one study where we looked at whether drivers of different kinds of cars would behave in more or less ethical ways while driving on the road. In California, it's the law to stop for a pedestrian when you're encountering a crosswalk and there's someone there waiting to cross. It's a ticketable offense. People get tickets. What we did was just monitor whether drivers of different kinds of cars, fancier cars, less fancy cars, would be more or less inclined to stop for a person that we had waiting to cross at a crosswalk. Here's how we did it. Here's the driver, here's our pedestrian, off to the left, approaching the crosswalk as the driver of the red truck successfully stops. The bus driver steps on the gas and almost runs our pedestrian over. Here's the driver of a more expensive car, a Prius, driving right through. Here's another BMW driver in this case, driving right through. So we did this for hundreds of different cars on several consecutive days. Again, we're just tracking whether drivers of different kinds of cars are being more or less inclined to attend to this other person and stop for a few seconds to let them cross. The more expensive your car was, the more likely you were to cut our pedestrian off. Drivers of more expensive cars were close to 50%, showed a 50% likelihood of cutting the other person off. Drivers of our least expensive car category, none of them cut our person off. And you could say that's for a lot of different reasons. Maybe they can't afford the ticket. Maybe drivers of more expensive cars have more places to go. That's actually not the case. It's just a stereotype. But at least initial evidence that your privilege, your resources, how much you have, can manifest in very subtle ways in everyday life and just how you navigate these everyday kinds of interactions in social situations. Now, when the pandemic came along, as many of you know, there was all sorts of social confusion. It's almost as if people were presented with an opportunity to create new social norms because so much of what we knew about life had just been eradicated. And so we were interested in what kinds of norms emerge. Who are the people during pandemics at the very beginning who really focus on themselves, who acquire things, who become less attentive to others, who wear masks only if it protects them, and for instance, not motivated to wear masks if they're informed that mask wearing helps others. So we've run a bunch of different studies now looking at this. Who hoards goods? The answer is fairly easy, those that can afford them. Who wears masks to protect self versus others? We've run a bunch of studies now showing that mask wearing, just as an act in and of itself, if we frame it as an act you can engage in to benefit yourself, people of privilege have no problem doing it. The moment mask wearing gets framed as an action to benefit others, it becomes way less appealing, way less motivating. Who deserves to be vaccinated first? Who engages in actions that prioritize? This was at a time when vaccines were more limited in supply. Who is it that cuts lines or feels they're more entitled to vaccines? Also people of privilege, suggesting that in all sorts of different contexts, with privilege comes an increased sense of entitlement and deservingness. And it's not just how much you deserve. It's also what you think other people deserve. So when you encounter someone, you're a student, let's say you meet someone who didn't do well on a test. You've got a situation. They didn't do well on a test. How do you explain that to yourself? What's the story you tell? to yourself to make sense of why they didn't do well. In social psychology, that's called attribution. What are the attributions you make? And we know from a lot of work that there's something called the fundamental attribution error. When someone has something happen to them, the kinds of explanations that you generate reference qualities of a person as opposed to features of a situation. So a person failed a test because they're lazy, because they're stupid, because they didn't work hard. Not because maybe they had a family member they needed to take care of, or maybe they didn't sleep well at night, or maybe they have so much going on in their life and they're working multiple jobs that they couldn't afford to study for the test. That's not what you go to. You go to features of a person. So, you can reference, when thinking about what happens to other people and whether they deserve that thing or not, controllable or dispositional aspects of a person, qualities within people, or circumstantial forces, contextual environmental factors outside of a person that impinge on a person and lead them to experience the outcomes that they experience. So when thinking about something like poverty, and people do this all the time, you see this in the media, you see this in news stories, explaining why poverty persists in the US, for example. You can talk about how poor people are poor because they're lazy, they lack willpower, they engage in poor planning, they lack ambition. These are all features of people. You blame poverty on the person experiencing it. Or, Americans are way less prone to doing this, mind you, you can reference features of a situation, like the experienced threat, the adversity, the low wages, the unemployment, the relatively speaking, diminished political influence that poor people have, is all being factors that contribute to poor people being poor. The point is, when explaining all sorts of different things, including poverty, the deservingness of the poor, you can leverage different kinds of explanations. And what we find is that wealthier people not only feel more deserving of the good things in life they have, they're also far more likely to attribute things like poverty to features of a person that are controllable, as opposed to features of a situation that might be changed to reverse inequality. And we found this trend across 34 different countries, 40,000 different individuals, all across the world. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to blame poverty on people and not on features of the situation that can, through no deservingness of people at all, cause people to experience poverty, even in a perpetual way. So, lots of people have, I'm imagining you've heard something like this. With great power comes great responsibility. Noblesse oblige. If you're noble, if you're privileged, if you wield power, you have a responsibility to care for the needs of others. I think that makes a lot of sense. That sounds really good. I think that is a value we should all aspire to, but it's not necessarily reflective of the world that we live in. What seems to happen with the psychological experience of power is that your shift goes from being responsible for others maybe to feeling more and more and more and more and more and more and more responsible for yourself. Your attentiveness to others diminishes. Your compassion for others seems to decrease. Your sense of entitlement increases, and your sense of me seems to go up. I think that's always problematic. It's been problematic for centuries, and I think it's particularly problematic in times like today, when power is becoming, and money, and wealth, and status, and influence, and political influence, is becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a select group of individuals. When we're faced with all sorts of threats that depend on us as a collective. So, when the pandemic was happening, We also, at the same time, not for the first time, but maybe for the first acute time, had all sorts of evidence of racial and historical injustice manifest in our social fabric. We had the pandemic and the inequality that it brought about. At the same time, disparities in influence and historical representation of humanization and dehumanization in this country. Black Lives Matter movement emerging in part as a reflection of that. At the same time, we had smoke filling the skies above LA because wildfires were all over the place. At a certain point, we had 13 uncontrollable wildfires, reminding us of omnipresent climate change. All sorts of very pressing problems right now that can't be confronted, cannot be tackled by just a handful of people. And so it's easy, I think, to blame those with power. These problems exist because you have so much more power than other people. There's some truth to that, as what I've talked about indicates. But what I think is also true is that people with power are showing the same kinds of biases that we ourselves show on a daily basis. I run. When I moved to Southern California, I learned that everyone has to run, so I just had to run to fit in. So I started running on the beach. Some days I don't really feel like running, but I go out on the beach and I start running and woo-hoo, am I way faster than I thought I was. And it's only until I'm running back that I realize, oh my God, there's a huge wind against me, and I'm just like fighting this wind. When the wind is helping you, it's really hard to realize that it's there. It's only when the wind's against you that you become mindful of the obstacle that's always been there. That is very similar to this idea of headwinds and tailwinds and of privilege. Easy to recognize the tailwinds that prevent us or get in the way of our getting to our goals. A lot harder to recognize the tailwinds, those often invisible forces that help us, often through forces of luck, get those things that we want but stand in others' way. Privilege is a kind of tailwind. We all do this. When we ourselves are thriving, it's easy to attribute our own inevitable success, our thriving, our achievement to things we ourselves did. After all, those are the things we did. Those are the stories we tell. We focus on the things we did. We're not always aware of all the factors that helped us get there in the first place that we had nothing to do with. And we're way less attuned to all the factors that others encounter, those who may not be thriving, those who may be struggling, that get in their way through no responsibility of their own. They just are happening to them because of bad luck, because of inequality in the situation, because of inequity in the environment. So, if we all do this, if this basic bias is reflective of a tendency we all engage in, what do we do about it? I think there are a lot of different answers. We're still struggling for new ones, to find new ones, but I want to highlight two that I think we might use and take with us when we walk out of this room. If there's one bit you can keep with you, maybe that bit comes here. So ways forward, and I want to highlight two that I think of as maybe particularly promising: awe and empathy. Now, in my lab, we've gotten really interested in awe and in its role in social collectives. Now, some of you may have never really thought about awe as something you can study. It turns out you can study awe. You can study what brings it about, why it exists, what role it might play in our lives and in our lives in a community. One of the things that we find is that awe, whether it's brought about as a result of something like the total solar eclipse, which we actually studied, we watched, we observed what that did to people, when they experienced it, or walks among giant trees. In California, we have some of the largest trees in the world, or via reminders of other people's contributions to the things you yourself benefit from. But whether awe is brought about in the natural environment, in the social environment, we find that it humbles the self. It brings about the sense of a small self, a kind of a sense that you're a little less important and more connected to something much bigger than you. And as a result of that, we find people become more empathetic, more attuned to the social collective, and more likely to engage in behaviors that benefit others. So just to give you a sense, in one study, we led people into a giant grove of trees, and they spend either 60 seconds looking up at those trees, being filled with awe, or they spend 60 seconds with their backs to the trees, looking up at a way less awe-inspiring big building. 60 seconds. When the 60 seconds are done, an experimenter walks up and ostensibly by accident trips over themselves and drops some pens on the ground. And we just watched how likely people are to bend down and pick up pens to help out this other person who, in this staged accident, ostensibly dropped them, okay? By accident. People filled with awe, 60 seconds, more likely to, in a questionnaire, feel more empathetic, to engage in more ethical decisions. They feel less entitled. They also pick up more pens to help out this other person, suggesting that awe may play this vital social role of reminding us of the vaster, more important things that we're a part of and causing us to engage in actions that benefit the collective. I also mentioned empathy, which I would define as just an increased likelihood to take the perspective of another person, to share a shared sense of common humanity, to see yourself in another person's shoes. Because as we know, it's so easy when we walk around in our lives to create these barriers that create differences between us and them. So in one version of this, we were interested in whether a 10-minute game can get people to experience what it's like for just 10 minutes in a little game, what it's like to be poor. And we watched what that experience did in changing their values over the course of 6 months. You can all play this game. It's at playspent.org, easy to play. In the game, you're just asked to imagine that while 14 million Americans are unemployed, you're one of them, your savings are gone, you've lost your house, you're down to your last $1,000. Can you make it through the month? That's it. And participants are asked to play this game and to survive 1 month with limited resources. They need to find a job, they need to find out how to get to that job, but what participants who play this game immediately recognize via this game, because I guarantee you, when you play this game, you're trying to win. You're trying to survive 1 month. But you realize how, despite your best efforts, no matter how good your decisions are, things come up. Your kid gets sick, your car breaks down that you didn't expect. You just get unlucky. How difficult it can be, despite your best efforts, to escape poverty. And it's just a 10-minute game that simulates that difficulty. You get Americans to play this game, the world can be unfair, people can experience poverty despite their best efforts. Not only after the game, 24 hours later, up to 5 months later, this makes them more compassionate to the poor, more egalitarian, more likely to support progressive taxation to enhance social safety and welfare programs. You don't just have to play a 10-minute game. We've run another study where we had participants watch just a 46-second long video of child poverty around the world that served as a brief reminder of the needs of others in the social environment, made people feel for just a few minutes more compassionate. Afterwards, we gave them a chance to help another person. In a control condition, look at the left. That's people who are poor compared to, on the right, people who are rich. People who are poor give up significantly more of their own time, we're measuring this in terms of minutes, to help out the stranger that they've just met who's in distress, relative to their richer, more well-off counterparts. But when participants in a different condition watched just that 46-second long video, when they were given the opportunity to help, the wealthy, the privileged in our study became just as helping, just as generous, just as likely to give up their own valuable time to help out this other person that they don't know, as people in our study who are of lesser means, who are less well off. All I think this says is that we can create these barriers between us and them that are exacerbated by the privilege that we experience, and that reminders, interventions, contact, exposure, meeting people that remind you of the different, diverse experiences of others can trigger that compassion and make you behave in kinder, more considerate ways. And I think writ large, at the broadest level, I would say that some people are luckier than others, and some people are way more privileged than others. But sometimes in life, you might find yourself flying in first class. Not because of something you did, but because of just simple, random luck. And it's in those situations, not just when you're flying first class, but in all the different situations you find yourself in life where you're, for various reasons, doing a little better off, a little more thriving, a little more advantaged vis-a-vis others. It's those situations where the most delicate trick comes at play, and that is to remind yourself that while you may have contributed to yourself getting there, there are lots of other things that you didn't do that helped you also get there. And there are lots of other things that people don't deserve that prevented them from being in the same position as you. And if you remember that, you'll be motivated to be a little more kind, a little more empathetic, a little more compassionate, and that might help drive just the kind of social cohesion we need, the kind of togetherness we need as a collective and as a species to surmount some of the most pressing, daunting problems and issues that we're faced with as a species. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks to all of my collaborators. That's a picture of my lab. I'm so indebted to them. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to take questions and comments from the audience, from our virtual audiences elsewhere. I've been reminded to ask you that if you do have a question or a comment or a criticism or just want to say hello, to please use the microphones on either side.
Hi. Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hi. My name is Rosie. I'm the Dean of Libraries.
Hi, Rosie.
I loved hearing you talking about awe and its power to inspire social cohesion, because I think a lot about our space and how people behave in a collective space, the extent to which they take responsibility to care for that space. So that was a very interesting comment. I was curious whether you spent much time studying the outliers, because we know there are many philanthropists. I myself, I feel, grew up in a pretty privileged circumstance. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and therefore I feel as though, as a result of what they had experienced, the tremendous disadvantages that they had experienced, they were very, very mindful of their responsibility to look after other people So I was just curious whether you have studied the philanthropists of the world, because they are out there, but they
They're
are the
definitely-
outliers.
yeah.
So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your comment. I think the comment that you bring up about awe is so interesting. There's so little that we know. I think so much more to be done about its role in inspiring a sense of responsibility for collective spaces, like nature, like the environment, which is something that we want to be super mindful of as we go into the future. But to your second point of outliers, in this science, we're a science based on averages across lots of people, you know? So there are definitely outliers in all of our studies. And I don't have a good sense, because they're outliers, of what particular, whether it's personality or environmental factors, are driving their deviations from the norm across the board. But I would imagine that it's a confluence of things, including upbringing, history, lived experience. I can speak anecdotally, you know, for instance, there are wealthy philanthropists who talk about a transformative experience that they might have, like Bill Gates, who talks about early experiences that he had traveling the world and being exposed to very, very, very severe poverty as being a significant factor in shifting his value system and his sense of responsibility for the greater good. I think that kind of exposure, that kind of direct experience with need can play a big role. I think, you know, I grew up in Israel, and you know, your anecdote about your grandparents who were Holocaust survivors just resonates on a personal level, because I had Holocaust survivors in our apartment building, and I can imagine what kind of experience that has in shifting values and responsibility generationally, you know. I think, like, part of me feels a little cynical about wealthy philanthropy, in part because I know that it exists, and I'm not to say that you're not an example of that, but there are many, many often talked about examples that I think are problematic in a few ways. One of which is that simply by virtue of talking about wealthy philanthropy, you make people think that wealth isn't necessarily a problem, when in reality the majority of rich people do not give lots to charity. And when they do, it's often toward cultural systems, whether it's an alma mater or museums, that you could argue benefit their own elite groups, their own, say, offspring, as opposed to benefiting or being driven by a motivation to actually help the needs of the poor or the needs of those of lesser means in many cases. So I think that the instances of philanthropy that do exist have a lot of different motivations, not all of which are compassion and a desire or driven by a concern for the well-being of others.
Dr. Piff?
Yeah.
We have a question from our Harborside campus. We could say the opposite of empathy is selflessness. What would be the opposite of awe? I think this is important to study in how we could minimize the toxic thinking that arises of it.
I don't know what the opposite of awe is. That's a great question. I would say that if you, for instance, we find that people who are a little more narcissistic, who feel a little more special and important, they're less able to experience awe for some reason. So the opposite of awe might be something like pride. Awe makes people feel a little smaller, a little less significant, a little more humble. So the opposite of pride is a sense of entitlement, a sense of pride, a sense of self-focus that kind of diminishes your ability to recognize the value of others, the significance of the world that you're a part of. I think pride is an important emotion in certain ways. It's also a powerfully potent drug in many other ways. Pride can, to the extent, confidence is good. But excessive pride, hubristic pride, and if you're interested in this, there's a bunch of research on something called hubristic pride. It can really be problematic because it makes you feel more special than others, more important, more deserving than other people. And that's not good for you, and that's not good for other people around you. So I would say that the pernicious form of awe, the opposite of awe, that we need to be mindful of and wary of is pride and like kind of almost a constrained, narrow focus on me, as opposed to a mindful attention to the we that we're invariably a part of.
And I have another question. This is also from the Harborside campus. Do you think people now try harder to be empathetic after this study?
What do you think? I don't know. Are you going to try to be more empathetic? Yeah, I mean, not to make it I think that's a really interesting question. I wonder about what, the talk that I give, and I'm not alone in talking about this. There are many people that study this and talk about the value of empathy and compassion. I wonder, I don't really know. Like, what effect does that have when we communicate about our science to others? Does that mean that when you get up and leave in 25 minutes, and you go about your day, and the dust settles on this, and you came because of a class, so you check that box, or you came because the title was interesting, so you check that box, and the dust settles, and you go home and you turn on Netflix, or you make some food, and you start going to, like, what of this do you keep? Does it change you? I don't really know. I'd like to think that it plants some seeds. I don't know that the seeds necessarily grow. I'd like to think that sometimes they do, but you got to nourish them yourself. Like, for instance, we know, I've run a study where I get people who say, I never experienced awe. I don't even know what you're talking about. When you talk about awe, I don't know what that means. We get them into a study where for 2 weeks, we try to get them through these 2-minute daily exercises to experience more awe. After a few days, they're still having a lot of trouble going around finding it. But by week 2, from practice of going out into the world, and all of a sudden we start getting these entries sent to us that were like, yeah, I didn't even think about this, but just yesterday, I walked around the corner and I looked at light reflecting on the pavement through leaves, and I just thought, whoa, I'd never thought about it like that. So someone who says they've never experienced awe, just by being in our study, after a few days of us not pushing them, 2 minutes, by the second week, finds awe in as quotidian, everyday a way as shadow on pavement. So I'd like to think that little things that I say, that your professors say, that you read in a book, that you think about, can have these ripple effects. But I don't really know. But it is why I do what I do. So I'd like to think it has a little bit of potency.
I have a whole list of things. If I can do
Limit it
two
to just
of them.
the top 35 items of the list.
Two. First, just a connection with awe, because we in Rhode Island don't have the California trees and that kind of majesty for awe. So what I do with my students in the classroom is to contemplate, to meditate on gratitude. And gratitude, and that's amazing what a transformation that is.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what you're talking about, is because gratitude means you're focused on what someone else
Or
has
something
done
else.
for
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally
And I-
resonate with you. I think gratitude, I would say awe brings about more gratitude, and that gratitude, you might say, is actually a building block for awe. A kind of a sense of appreciation, a sense of gratitude for others, the world around you. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the recognition
Yeah.
that you have been blessed.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
The other comment I was going to have is about lived experience as reinforcing the status of being rich or poor in terms of the isolation or connection.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're rich, you don't have to cook, you don't have to drive, you don't have to clean your house, you don't have to do anything. But when
Yeah.
you don't have that money, you are dependent on other people
Right.
as they are on you as well.
Yeah.
So your lifestyle is constantly being reinforcing of that.
Absolutely.
Those biases.
So you're beautifully highlighting something that I have thought about, and the way that I would put it is that what wealth buys you, for lack of a better term, in many ways, is space. If you think about what wealth affords you in the form of lived experience, you first of all usually live in a bigger house with more rooms in it so that you have more space from the other people living within that house. You have more space between you and the people living in the other house. When you go to work, you're more likely to go on your own versus, say, commute with public transportation. You're more likely to be in a position of giving demands from above than of needing to work within a group that's, say, subordinate and needing to cooperate. When you fly first class, you've got more space between you and other people. In so many ways, and this is the work of various sociologists, wealth affords you space, more territory, whereas being of lesser means that you need to rely on others to achieve desired ends. So I would say that's actually, when we look at our effects in all of those studies, what we're finding is partly just a reflection of that basic difference in lived experience or in the social ecologies that people with means versus those with lesser means occupy.
Yeah, it's true. When I came back from India after living with a family there, oh my God, I came home, I thought I lived in a palace.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You know, the difference of that. And space and time, too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just a philanthropist comment, look at the difference between Jeff and Mackenzie. Bezos and Bezos.
Yeah.
You know, he can, and he sees his employees and the cars, and he sees how underpaid they are. He fights unions. He won't give, I mean, how much money do you need in the world? And he won't give it back to his own employees. And she's just divesting herself, leaving left.
Yeah.
How did they ever stay? Well, they didn't stay married, so that answers.
You know the answer to your own question.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will spare you the rest of.
No, thank you. Thank you for those are wonderful comments.
Hi. Grace Flores,
Hi,
business
Grace.
student. So I was wondering that, based on your studies, would you believe that people of wealth are above the law, or do they believe they are above the law? Considering that you showed us the one with the pedestrians, where people with nicer cars would just not stop, even though it was the law.
What do you think, Grace? What do you think I would say?
I think you would agree with me where they do believe sometimes they are above the law.
Yeah. When I ran those studies, yes, I would say that. I don't think they are above the law.
But think so.
I think the law is often disproportionately applied. And I think that people do think they're above the law as a result of being of higher status. We ran a study. When I ran these studies, yes, that's what I was starting out to say. I was so curious, like, what is going on? Because we ran another study where we had people, like it was a rigged computer game. We knew what people would get in this game with this virtual die that was rolling. We knew that they would always get this one score. And it was rich people who were lying to us, like, yeah, I rolled perfect sixes all the time. Like, what are they doing? What do they think is happening? And what we found, like when we interviewed them afterwards, is that a lot of people would talk about how, the rules aren't as applicable to them because there are these kind of unspoken rules. Yeah, there are the rules of society, but then another rule is to always be looking for opportunities to find ways to gain, to be more competitive. We don't talk about that, but we do that all the time, always looking for ways to cut. People do that. The more privileged you are, the way that you talk about it is, the more I think the system has inculcated you in part too, but you're looking for opportunities to get ahead, and you're less likely to prioritize the rules. You think they're less applicable to you because there's these other set of unspoken rules that you live by.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
How you doing? I'm Brian. I'm a student here.
Hi, Brian. Let's all say hi, Brian, at once.
Oh, I can take it off.
Hi, Brian.
So I'm here for an extra credit assignment.
Perfect,
For my
yeah.
professor up there.
Yeah, so you
What's up,
get it.
Professor Les? How you doing?
Professor Les, does Brian get extra credit? Yeah, done.
I got to
Thumbs
write the
up.
reflection first, but I'll do it.
Wait, is this your reflection? Are we watching you get extra credit right now, or is?
Maybe
Okay.
I'll get an extra point or two, but so you brought up upbringing as like a big reason, like the difference between whether like a wealthy person like would show compassion or like, you know, the other like bad side of things. I find that to be like a massive thing, like, cause like I was always brought up to be like super grateful and like compassionate towards everyone, cause like not everyone has the same advantages or privileges that I do. But like I have people close to me or like people that I know that are like the complete opposite, like they feel fully entitled. So you listed that like as one thing among like a bunch of other factors that might determine it. Like I was wondering how much of an impact you think upbringing has, like proportionately.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, it's a great question. You know, I'm sitting up here and it's like what I have to say is based in science. We don't know. We don't know. So I would just be speculating.
Yeah, well, I was just...
My
your
speculative
point of view,
answer
yeah.
is that childhood environment is huge. Okay. Huge. Here's the problem, though. So there's a bunch of anthropological, sociological work done on different families and what are the kinds of values that different parents teach their kids, and how do those values differ as a function of wealth. So for instance, like anthropologists have gone into households of means with money, and one of the first things they recognize is that parents who love their kids invest in their kids. And they tell their kids, you're special. And our job here as parents is to help find out the things you're special at. So let's pay for your saxophone lessons, and let's make sure you go to France and take some culinary lessons. And you're just investing, right? In specialness. And so you're teaching your kid this value of individuality and of independence and of uniqueness, which isn't necessarily a problem, but it's different from the value system that households with lesser means or that come from disadvantaged backgrounds teach their kids, which is more about not standing out, of fitting in, of reading the room, of figuring out what other people are doing and knowing how to play by those rules. And so upbringing plays a big role, but think about the generational transmission of those values, right? If a family has wealth, they're more likely to think that wealth matters, investment in kids matter, they have more means to invest in their kids. So their kids are more likely to acquire these ideas that I'm special, I deserve, I'm unique. And so that's how they grow up, that's how they think about money, that's how they think about the role of money. All of which is to say, I think it's really difficult to break through these barriers for all sorts of strong psychological and circumstantial reasons, but people do it. You just need to be really mindful of it. Because as a new parent myself, I was just talking to Amy about this, like I see how difficult it is to be egalitarian. Like, my child is going to go to a school, but I want my child to have the best school experience they can have. I'm not trying to make a point through my child's life and have them go to a school that's going to not give them the kinds of educational resources that I'd like them to have. So I'm going to look for a good school, right? And so you see how like all of a sudden we start spinning self-interest or vicarious self-interest into these other things that make it just feel like, hey, I'm trying to do what's right by myself or what's right by my kids. Anyway, here I am like just being free associative. I think it's very difficult. I think childhood environment plays a big role. I think people do transcend those all the time, but it's difficult to do.
Awesome, thanks man, appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Our next question is from our Charlotte campus. Does gender have a major effect in your studies?
Yeah. Well, here's what I would say. Money makes you less compassionate, less empathetic, less kind, whether you're male or female. But males in general in all of my studies are less compassionate, less cooperative, a little less empathetic, more likely to engage in unethical decisions, more likely to cheat. But I don't think that that's a biological. I think men versus women are social. We're looking at cultural effects because of socialization. That's what I think my findings reflect. But generally speaking, men in my studies and in many other studies report and behave in slightly, I'm not saying huge effects, but in slightly less compassionate ways than the women. This is looking at sex in a very, very binary way. But yes, in those studies, women are more compassionate, more empathetic.
All right, and a question from our virtual audience off campus is, does altruism exist?
Depends on your definition. But I teach a science of, Lisa, how are we doing for time?
We're great right now.
Okay. I teach a science of compassion class all across the University of California system. And it's all about this emerging science of human kindness. People study this. One of the things we've learned is that kindness is a feature of our biology. Babies come into the world with a predisposition to being kind and to liking things that are kind, even shapes that help other shapes, they like more than shapes that harm other shapes. So people study this. All right, so I'm teaching this class, and I get this question every time I teach this class, which is there such a thing as altruism? Is there such a thing? And my answer is, it depends on definitions. But if your definition is there such a thing as kindness that is purely selfless, hard for me to really know, but I would say it's not necessarily the kind of kindness I'm interested in, and I don't see how it could be necessarily possible. Because take someone who, let me just work us through a couple of examples. Your friend asks you for a ride to the airport. You give your friend a ride to the airport. That was kind, yes? Can I get a thumbs up? Kind thing to do? Okay, but let's say the next day you turn to your friend and you say, can I get a ride to the airport because I gave you a ride yesterday? Was your act of kindness kind? Less kind, right? Okay, that happens all the time. So people get rewarded for their kindness all the time. Let's say that you give money to someone who's in need of money because people are around you, which we know people do all the time. You give because of reputation, because you want to look good in others' eyes. Is that real kindness, or is that driven by a more self-oriented motivation? Yes. Okay, so real kindness is kindness that exists irrespective of any benefit to the self, right? Well, what kind of kindness is that? Because even at the most basic level, let's say you do something kind because it's what you believe in, because you know that if you don't do that kind thing, you're going to feel guilty. Well, isn't doing something so you don't feel guilty also rewarding? Also selfish? All of which is to say, I think you can take any altruistic act, and let's say someone martyrs themselves. They throw themselves in front of a train to save another person. They kill themselves. They make the ultimate sacrifice. Well, what if they think it's going to be met with a reward in the afterlife? Okay. All of which is to say, I don't know that real selflessness or real altruism is necessarily even an interesting question because it's impossible to test. I think that behaviors vary in the extent to which they're driven by a concern for others versus a concern for self. I think when you do something nice for someone and expect them to do something nice for you in return, that's more selfish than doing something nice for someone just because you want to. So I don't know about true altruism, but I think that behaviors do vary in terms of how selfless they are. But there may be no such act as truly selfish. There may be no altruistic act that's truly selfless on a very, on the most rudimentary, fundamental level. I don't even know what that would be. Like you're deciding to act based on a coin flip. Because the moment you're doing something because you believe in it, you're acting in accordance with your goals, that's self-relevant, you could say on some very basic level, a little selfish.
So,
hi, I'm Professor Taylor
Hi,
here,
Professor Taylor.
in College of Engineering and Design. I don't have a question. I wanted to share something with you. The greatest experience of awe and peace and joy I've ever had in my life was 2 days after my house burned down. I lost everything I owned. But my 2 daughters, 5 and 7, were swimming in a pool at the hotel the Red Cross had put us in. And the smiles on their faces and the fact that they were safe and alive was the greatest joy, moment, and peace of my life ever. And I had nothing. I had just the clothes on my back. They had the clothes on their back. And I will never forget that moment. When I had nothing, I was the happiest. So thank you for your talk. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing that.
Hi there, my name's McKenna. Quick question. I grew up with hardships with having a learning disability, and my sister was raised alongside me. We had the same upbringing, but my sister doesn't really have compassion into the same way I do. I was wondering if people could grow into compassion and appreciation for loved ones and life around them.
Yeah, fortunately. I mean, I don't mean like every time I get a question to go back to the research or the science, but was it McKenna?
Yeah.
Yeah, your question nicely, thank you for sharing that. Dovetails with some work by Dave DeSteno and Paul Condon, among others, showing that people who have experienced hardship and struggled in life, you acutely measure their compassion and empathy. People who have experienced hardship and struggled in life are more empathetic and more compassionate than people who haven't. Okay. So the science backs up that observation. Okay. And thus, I strongly believe that compassion is not a trait that we're endowed with, but a state or a tendency or a muscle, however you want to put it, a capacity that we can all grow.
Okay.
And we can grow it as individuals. We can be thrown into circumstances that demand that we be compassionate, but even people who haven't experienced hardship can cultivate it. Okay. And if you're interested, there's lots of ways to do it. There's even compassion cultivation programs. You can do online training. You can do these. You could sign up for all sorts of different ways to increase your capacity for compassion. You can also increase it in your own way by doing lots of different kinds of things. But yes, you can grow into it as opposed to being endowed with it.
Okay. It's hard growing up with hardships with my learning disability and being told I'm not going to get to where I am today, because I was told that. I am on my second college, working on my second degree. My sister is an appreciative, compassionate, and just positive person. She looks towards the negatives and doesn't appreciate what life has to offer. So it's frustrating, and she uses our parents for basically everything they got.
Yeah.
So I always hope that she grows into the compassion and positivity and the appreciation that I have for my parents for what they've pushed for me to do, supported me through the hardships that I had to go through school, you name it, health problems. Yeah, you get the gist of what I'm saying. But
I do. I hope so. I hope so too, for her sake.
It's hard because I'm going on 24 and she's 28 and doesn't have any of those traits. And it's hard to say this, but I feel like I'm the more mature sibling than she is in some degree.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you for reassuring me that it could happen.
One of the best ways to make it happen is by practicing, not to say that you don't, you probably do. And practicing compassion toward the person. So often people who, it's a cliche, hurt people hurt people. Heard people who feel heard, are less likely to hurt people. So sometimes the tough thing is to You know, this is almost like you and I are having a personal conversation with a bunch of people in the room. But the toughest thing in situations, especially in family situations, it's so, like, you feel so right in your judgment because it's like you've lived it, you've seen it, it's so personal. And so the hardest thing to do is to just try to reset a little bit and give the person, the sibling, the benefit of the doubt. And I'm sure you do this all the time. And the extent to which you can, ironically, is going to be the thing that makes all the difference.
And I found that it becomes exhausting because I try and I try and I try. It goes in one ear and out the other, and it just becomes exhausting. At the end of the day, my parents always remind me, you can't take enough care.
Yeah, it's true.
And it's a hard pill to swallow because I hardly see her anymore.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't make the time for my family, she doesn't make the time for me. I haven't seen her in over a year since I used to watch her.
So we have another question from the Charlotte campus. Do you feel as wealth grows, compassion and awe goes down? For example, lottery winners with quick riches?
Yeah. So we didn't do this study, but people did a study of lottery winners, and their compassion goes down. You win the lottery, I mean, in their case, they measure attitudes toward poor and social welfare programs, and all of a sudden, when people win the lottery, this was a study done of UK lottery winners, their compassion, as measured by empathy to the poor, goes down. So, yeah, I think so.
I'm Cleo. I have a curious question. Did you receive, like, throughout your research, did you get any different outcomes and, like, unexpected outcomes that you didn't think you were going to get?
Yeah. I mean, the first study we ran here was the one where we gave people money and asked how much of it they would want to share. And I wasn't even testing this question. I was testing a different question. And I expected people with means to be more generous. I mean, that's just what I would expect. Even though we have stereotypes about, like, you know, Scrooge, Uncle Scrooge, or, you know, like, yeah. But we were using, like, looking at a community sample here, people who really did not have, compared to really wealthy people in Berkeley. And I couldn't believe that we found it. So I thought that was a mistake. So then I followed up. We've run other studies that I didn't talk about today where it's a little more nuanced. So for example, I got a question about this earlier today. When you look at compassion and you look at wealthy people, there are two different ways you can be wealthy. Or lots of different ways, but let's say two for the sake of argument. You could have earned wealth or become wealthy yourself, or you could have been born into wealth and be wealthy because you're inherited wealth, right? And if I'm looking at those two groups of wealth, who do you think is more compassionate? People who have been poor but become wealthy, or people who were born into wealth?
The ones who go into wealth, not...
Are more compassionate.
Yeah.
Yeah, we find the opposite. So if you are born into wealth, you're actually more compassionate to the poor than people who were born poor and became rich. And in those studies, this is led by a graduate student of mine, the reason for that, she finds, is that if you were born poor but became rich, that changes how you think of the world. It makes you see social mobility as attainable. If you've made it, so can they. So if someone hasn't made it, that's their fault. Whereas people who are born into wealth, at least in these studies, still see the system as potentially unfair. Look, I didn't do anything and I'm wealthy, so maybe other people didn't do anything and they're poor, so they feel a little more empathetic. So we're always finding patterns that are surprising that we want to follow up on.
Wow. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, and we'll go with that one last question right there.
Last question.
Hi, Dr. Piff. I'm also here for Professor Less's class, but
Yep,
you
shout out to Professor Les. Extra credit time.
But you actually talked in my psychology class just a
Oh, yeah.
couple periods ago. Yeah,
Nice.
Hi.
Hello.
And I wanted to ask something that kind of connects to what we talked about in there and here. I'm sorry, it's a little long-winded, but So you talked about how people that were put through the simulation on the website to be in a poverty situation for like a month, and it created somewhat long-term effects of empathy and kindness. And if you remember, Professor Cosmini had a very rude interaction with a man in a Porsche. And I was wondering if that wasn't that man's Porsche, like if he was temporarily borrowing it, you know, he doesn't actually have the wealth. He doesn't actually have power. And like when you were temporarily put in first class, did you study at all what long-term effects are of that?
Yeah, I don't. It's a great question. Yeah. So the game, I see the parallel that you're drawing between the game and that. The game is simulating, like you're taking the perspective of another person, having a different kind of lived experience. And I think if you're put into positions of wealth temporarily, if it's simulating lived experience in a very strong way, I would think it would have similar kinds of effects, possibly in the opposite direction. You know, but we don't know. I think there's a lot to what you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. Thank you all. I think that means we're out of time.
Daisha's going to come up. I do want to thank you. That was a very inspiring talk for me. And I want to personally thank you, Paul, because you know, it was 25 years ago for me that I was sitting in my grad school seminars having these types of discussions, doing these types of studies, and you really reminded me of why I'm so passionate about this field, why it's so important with our, you know, someone might think, you know, why showing somebody a video, how's that going to help the world? But we can change people, or we at least understand why people do the things that they do. And you've reminded me how much I miss doing that kind of work. So thank you.
Well, we'll welcome you back with open arms.
The other thing I want to say is I hope you've made friends here at JWU in the time you've been with us. And please consider us. We're starting undergraduate research centers in our colleges. And so if you ever need a site for a replication study or a partner to see coastal differences, please reach out to us. You have an active and willing group of people who
you could all be
want
participants in my studies.
So now for the formal part, I want to thank to our audience for asking such interesting and thoughtful questions, and Dr. Piff, thank you again for your thought-provoking presentation. At this time, on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, the Inter-College Cultural Life Committee, our student host, Daisha Johnson, and our senior administration, we would like to offer you a gift of appreciation for being with us today, and this certificate, to recognize your outstanding contributions to the academic world. So, Daisha,
thanks.
can you help me?
Oh, thanks so much. Oh.
There we go. Anybody going to take a picture of us?
A mental photo. In your mind's eye, remember this moment. Ken, get that iPhone out, not fast enough. Thanks, Rich.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you. So much fun. Have a good afternoon, everyone. I think that was the last thing. Oh, no, I was supposed to say something else, but I already
You did
wanted to
great.
go.
Rich, thanks.